The alarm did not sound like a warning. It sounded like the station was screaming. I was standing on the observation deck of Colony Dorn 7 when the first impact hit. The floor dropped under my feet, then rose again, and every light along the corridor flickered from white to red in less than a second. I am Kale Ondrin, station liaison for the Dorith Mining Authority, and in 11 years of service I had never heard that alarm outside of a drill. This was not a drill. A rogue debris cluster had slipped past our outer sensors, moving faster than anything our tracking systems expected. It tore through the shield array before anyone could raise a counterfield, and then it kept going, straight into the lower ring where 412 people lived and worked. I watched the damage reports climb across my screen faster than I could read them. Hull breach in Sector 9. Pressure loss in Sector 11. Fires spreading through the recycling deck, feeding on oxygen that was supposed to keep people alive, not burn them out of their homes. My hands were shaking so badly I could not type my access code on the first try. The station commander, an older Dorith named Belwick Adrun, appeared beside me with a data slate already glowing in his grip. His skin had gone pale gray, which for our species means something close to what humans call the color draining from your face. "Kale," he said, "send the beacon." "Send it now." "To who?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Protocol was clear. When a colony cannot save itself, it calls the nearest allied fleet for help, and the nearest fleet, according to every chart I had ever studied, belonged to humanity. "Anyone who will come," Belwick said. "It does not matter who." I keyed the emergency channel and sent the call. My voice cracked twice while I recorded it, listing our coordinates, our casualties, our failing life support, and the collapsing wall between Sector 9 and the vacuum of open space. When I finished, I sat back and waited, the way you wait for a verdict you already suspect will be bad. We did not have to wait long. The response came back in less than 4 minutes, which for a distress signal crossing that much distance should have been impossible. A voice, low and steady, filled our comms. "This is Response Wing 12. We have your beacon. We are already moving. Do not shut off your beacon. Do not stop transmitting your coordinates. Help is coming." I felt something in my chest loosen, just slightly. Then Belwick leaned toward the console and asked the question I had not thought to ask. "Which unit is Response Wing 12? Are they diplomatic corps, search and rescue specialists?" There was a pause on the other end, a very short pause, but I noticed it, the way you notice a held breath. "They are the nearest available unit," the voice said. "ETA 9 minutes. That is not long enough for you to worry about who they are." The channel closed. I looked at Belwick. Belwick looked at me. Neither of us said anything, because neither of us knew what to say. 9 minutes should have felt like good news. Instead, something about the way that voice had answered made the back of my neck prickle with unease. I had studied humans for most of my career. I had sat across tables from their trade envoys, their scientists, their careful, measured diplomats who spoke slowly and chose every word like it was a precious stone. Those were the humans I knew, calm, patient, almost gentle in how they handled disagreements between species that did not always understand one another. I had heard stories, of course. Every species that dealt with humans had heard stories. Rumors about other kinds of humans, the ones who did not sit at negotiating tables, the ones sent when talking was no longer an option. I had always assumed those stories were exaggerated, the way frightening stories tend to grow larger every time someone repeats them. I was about to find out how wrong I had been. 9 minutes is a strange unit of time when your station is dying around you. I spent the first 2 of them helping redirect emergency crews towards Sector 9, where the hull breach was worst. I spent the next 3 watching pressure readings drop in 3 more sectors, each drop making my stomach twist tighter. By minute 6, Sector 11 had lost artificial gravity entirely, and reports were coming in of colonists trapped behind a jammed blast door, unable to reach the evacuation pods. At minute 8, my scanner picked up an incoming vessel. It did not look like the sleek transport ships humanity usually sent for diplomatic missions. This ship was blunt and heavy, its hull scarred with old burn marks that had never been properly repaired, patched instead with mismatched plating that suggested it had seen far more damage than it should have survived. It moved fast, faster than our own shuttles were rated to travel, and it did not slow down as it approached our damaged docking ring. "They are going to hit the ring," Belwick said, his voice tight. They did not hit the ring. At the very last possible moment, the ship's thrusters flared, and it swung into a docking approach so tight and so precise that I actually gasped out loud. Whoever was piloting that vessel had either done this exact maneuver 100 times before, or they simply did not believe in slowing down for anything, including caution. The docking clamp engaged with a heavy metallic sound that rang through the whole station. A moment later, the airlock cycled open. I do not know exactly what I expected to see. Perhaps calm officers in pressed uniforms, moving with the same unhurried confidence I had always associated with human diplomats. Perhaps a rescue team with clean equipment and practiced, gentle voices, the kind you would want beside you in an emergency. What stepped through that airlock was something else entirely. There were 6 of them. The first through the door was a woman with short dark hair and a jaw set so tight it looked carved from stone. She was already speaking before her boots touched our deck plating, her voice sharp and fast, giving orders to the crew behind her without once looking back to check if they were following. Her name, I would learn later, was Ellie Marsh, and she moved like someone who had been interrupted in the middle of an argument and had simply carried that argument onto our station with her. Behind her came a heavier-built man named Derek Voss, his knuckles wrapped in worn tape, an expression on his face that reminded me of a storm that had not yet decided where to break. Then came a lean, quiet man called Owen Blake, whose eyes moved constantly across every corridor, every shadow, every flickering light, as if he were cataloging threats before they had even fully formed. None of them looked at me. None of them paused to introduce themselves, to explain their credentials, or to ask permission before moving deeper into our station. They simply moved, fast and certain, equipment already in their hands, voices already calling out sector numbers and damage reports to one another, as if they had memorized our station schematics during the 9-minute flight over. Belwick stepped forward, trying to greet them properly, the way protocol demanded. Ellie Marsh cut him off without slowing her stride. "Sector 9, she said. "Hull breach. How many people trapped?" We believe 40, perhaps more," Belwick stammered. "Then we are wasting time talking," she said, and kept walking. I hurried after them, my translator working overtime to keep up with the speed of their words. There was something in the way they spoke to one another, clipped and direct, stripped of every polite phrase I had grown used to hearing from human visitors. It was not rude, exactly. It was simply focused, the way a blade is focused, with no room left over for anything that was not immediately useful. As we moved through the damaged corridors, I noticed something else. Owen Blake, the quiet one, paused at a junction where a support strut had buckled, sending a shower of sparks down onto the floor below. He did not step around it carefully the way I would have. He grabbed the twisted metal with both hands and simply pulled, forcing it back into a position that would let the rest of us pass safely, his face showing no strain despite what must have been considerable effort. "Move," he said to me, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Do not stop here." I moved. We reached the edge of Sector 9 within minutes, faster than I believed possible, given the distance and the damage along the way. The air here was already thin, our emergency systems straining to hold back the vacuum pulling at the far end of the corridor. Through a cracked viewport, I could see stars where a wall should have been, and beyond them, drifting debris that had once been part of our outer hull. Ellie Marsh stopped at the sealed door leading into the worst of the damage. She placed one hand flat against it, feeling for something I could not identify, then turned to the rest of her team. "They are still alive in there," she said. "I can feel the air pressure shifting. Someone is moving on the other side." Derek Voss stepped up beside her, cracking his knuckles once, a habit I would come to recognize as something he did before difficult work rather than any threat toward another person. "Then we go get them," he said. I looked at Belwick. Belwick looked at me. Neither of us had ever seen anyone approach a sealed emergency door with the level of certainty these 6 strangers carried, as if the door itself was simply an obstacle that had made the mistake of standing between them and the people who needed saving. I did not yet understand what I was looking at. I only knew that something in the way these humans moved, Something in the tightness of their jaws and the sharpness in their eyes felt less like the calm diplomats I had studied for years, and far more like something waiting to be unleashed. Whatever it was, I had a growing feeling that our 412 colonists were about to be very lucky it had come. Derek Voss did not wait for permission. He pressed both palms against the sealed door, found the manual release panel hidden beneath a layer of scorched paint, and tore the cover away with a single hard pull. Sparks jumped from the exposed wiring, but he did not flinch. "This will vent what is left of the air on our side," Belwick warned, his voice rising with alarm. "We need pressure suits before we open that door." "Already ahead of you," Ellie Marsh said. I turned to see the rest of the team already sealing themselves into thin, flexible suits that had been pulled from compartments on their backs, suits that unfolded and locked into place faster than anything our own engineers had ever designed. Owen Blake tossed one toward me without asking whether I needed it, and I fumbled to pull it over my uniform, grateful for the warning even though nobody had spoken it directly to me. "Everyone sealed," a fourth voice called out. This was a woman named Grace Fenwick, her hair pulled back tight, a scanner device strapped across her forearm already blinking with readings from the other side of the door. I count 23 heat signatures. Some are moving, some are not. Nobody reacted to that second part with panic. They reacted with focus, the kind of focus that comes from people who have heard bad news many times before and have learned not to let it slow them down. "On my mark," Derek said, gripping the manual release lever. I braced myself, though nothing could have truly prepared me for what happened next. The door tore open with a violent gust of escaping air, and beyond it I saw the true scope of the damage. The debris cluster had punched clean through 2 levels, leaving a jagged wound of twisted metal and scattered cargo containers. Emergency lighting flickered weakly, and somewhere in the wreckage, a child was crying. The 6 humans moved into that ruined space as one unit, without hesitation, without discussion, each of them already knowing exactly what role to play. Ellie Marsh led with a portable light strapped to her shoulder, sweeping the beam across collapsed sections of flooring. Owen Blake moved to the far wall, testing its stability before anyone else stepped near it. Grace Fenwick's scanner kept calling out numbers, directing the team toward each trapped colonist with a precision that left no time wasted. I followed as closely as I could, though every instinct told me to stay back, to let the professionals handle what I clearly could not. Belwick stayed near the door, coordinating with station engineers over comms, trying to stabilize what little life support remained in this section. The first colonist we found was a young Dorith man named Pharaoh, pinned beneath a fallen support beam, his lower body trapped against the deck. He was conscious, his breathing rapid and shallow, fear plain across his face as he stared up at the strange, heavily suited figures surrounding him. "We are here to help you," Ellie Marsh said, crouching beside him, her voice suddenly gentler than anything I had heard from her since she arrived. "Tell me your name." "Pharaoh," he managed. "Pharaoh, I need you to stay very still. My colleague is going to move this beam, and it is going to be loud, but you are going to be fine." Derek Voss knelt on the other side of the beam, testing its weight with both hands before positioning himself properly beneath it. I expected him to call for equipment, for some kind of lifting tool or mechanical assistance. Instead, he simply set his shoulder against the metal, planted his feet, and pushed. The beam groaned, resisting at first. Then slowly, impossibly, it began to lift. I watched the muscles along his neck stand out with the effort, watched sweat break across his forehead despite the cold air rushing through the breached section, and still the beam continued rising until Grace Fenwick and Owen Blake were able to slide Pharaoh free from beneath it. The moment Pharaoh was clear, Derek let the beam drop back down with a heavy crash, then immediately turned toward the next collapsed section without pausing to catch his breath. "2 more heat signatures, 20 meters ahead," Grace called out. "One is not moving." That last detail sent a ripple of tension through the team, a subtle shift I noticed even though nobody said anything aloud. Their pace quickened, their movements becoming even more precise, as if every wasted second now carried a weight none of them were willing to accept. We found the next colonist, an older woman, trapped inside a maintenance closet that had been sealed shut when the surrounding wall buckled. Owen Blake worked at the jammed door with a small tool from his belt, his expression tight with concentration, muttering something under his breath that sounded less like a complaint and more like a promise. "Come on," he said quietly, to the door, to himself, to whoever needed to hear it. "Come on, open." The door gave way, and the woman inside collapsed forward into his arms, gasping for air that had grown thin and stale inside her sealed hiding place. Owen caught her easily, checked her breathing with quick, practiced movements, then handed her off to Ellie Marsh, who guided her carefully back toward the sealed door and the waiting arms of station medical staff. The final heat signature, the one that had not been moving, turned out to be a man named Callum Reyes, though not the human Callum Reyes I would later learn commanded this response wing. This was a Dorothy engineer who had been working near the breach when the debris struck, and he lay unconscious beneath a collapsed section of ceiling. Grace Fenwick reached him first, pressing 2 fingers against his neck, checking for signs of life with a focus so intense it seemed to shut out everything else happening around her. "He is alive," she said. "Barely. We need to move him now." What happened next stayed with me for a long time afterward. Derek Voss, without waiting for instructions, without checking whether it was safe, simply lifted the collapsed ceiling section on his own, holding it steady, while Owen Blake and Ellie Marsh pulled the unconscious engineer free. His arms shook with the strain, his breathing turned ragged, and still he held that weight steady until the last possible second, only releasing it once he was certain nobody remained beneath. I stood frozen through most of this, my translator struggling to keep pace with the rapid instructions passing between them, my mind struggling even harder to reconcile what I was seeing with everything I thought I understood about humans. These were not the calm, measured diplomats I had studied. These were something rawer, something driven by an urgency that seemed to come from somewhere deep and personal, as if every trapped colonist represented something they refused to lose, something they had perhaps lost before and would not lose again. By the time we cleared the last section of Sector 9, all 23 colonists had been recovered. 3 required immediate medical attention, beyond what our station could provide, and Response Wing 12 did not hesitate to offer their own medical supplies, superior to anything we carried, without a single question about compensation or protocol. As the last stretcher passed through the sealed door toward waiting medical teams, Ellie Marsh finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, pulling off her helmet and running a hand through hair damp with sweat. For the first time since her arrival, she looked toward me directly. "How many more sections need clearing?" she asked, her tone still sharp, still urgent, though something in her eyes had softened slightly now that this immediate crisis had passed. "Sector 11, I said, finding my voice at last. "Gravity failure. Colonists trapped behind a jammed blast door, unable to reach evacuation pods." Something shifted across her face at those words, something that reminded me of the storm I had seen building in Derek Voss earlier, though on her it looked different, colder somehow, more controlled. "Show us," she said. I hesitated only a moment before turning to lead the way, though a part of me wondered what exactly I was leading them toward, and what exactly they intended to do once we arrived. Behind me, I heard Owen Blake speaking quietly to Derek Voss, his voice low enough that my translator almost missed the words entirely. "Another jammed door," he said. "You know how I feel about jammed doors." "Yeah," Derek replied, cracking his knuckles once more. "Me too." I did not fully understand what that exchange meant. Not yet. But as we moved deeper into the damaged station, toward another group of colonists trapped and running out of time, I found myself grateful, more grateful than I had ever been in my career, that whoever had answered our distress call had sent these particular humans, and not the calm, patient ones I had always assumed would come. Something told me calm would not have been fast enough. Something told me that whatever waited for us in Sector 11 would need exactly this kind of urgency to survive it. Sector 11 looked worse than anything we had left behind. Without gravity, loose debris floated freely through the corridors, spinning slowly in the dim emergency light, and the silence here felt different, heavier, broken only by the distant groan of metal still settling from the impact. "Gravity generators failed here first," I explained, pulling myself along a handrail bolted to the wall, the movement unfamiliar and awkward without weight to guide me. The blast door sealed automatically when pressure dropped in the adjoining corridor. 12 colonists remained trapped behind it, including several children. At the word children, I saw Ellie Marsh's jaw tighten further, though she said nothing, simply pushing forward with renewed speed. We reached the blast door within minutes. It was a massive slab of reinforced alloy, designed to withstand exactly the kind of catastrophic failure we were now facing, which meant it had also done exactly what it was built to do, sealing itself shut and refusing every command we sent it. Grace Fenwick pressed her scanner against the door's surface, her expression tightening as numbers scrolled across the display. "Manual override is fused," she said. "Someone tried forcing it open from the other side and burned out the control panel completely." "Can we cut through it?" Owen Blake asked. "Not fast enough," Grace replied. "Air on the other side is already thinning. I am reading maybe 15 minutes before it becomes unsurvivable for anyone without a suit, and these colonists do not have suits." 15 minutes. I felt my stomach drop at the number, knowing exactly how quickly 15 minutes could disappear when everything around you seemed determined to work against you. "There has to be another way in," Ellie Marsh said, already moving further down the corridor, scanning the walls with quick, sharp glances. "Kale, does this station have secondary access points? Maintenance shafts? Anything?" I pulled up the schematics on my own device, my hands still unsteady, and found what I was looking for after a moment that felt far too long. "There is a maintenance shaft," I said, "but it runs directly behind the debris cluster that caused this breach in the first place. There could still be movement in that section. Loose fragments, unstable plating, possibly worse." "Worse how?" Derek Voss asked. I hesitated, because what I was about to say sounded almost unbelievable even to me, a lifetime resident of a mining colony that had seen strange things drift in from the deep dark beyond our charted systems. "Debris clusters like this one sometimes carry more than rock and metal," I said. "Scavenger swarms. Small creatures that live inside asteroid fields, drawn to warmth and motion. If any came through with the impact, they could be nesting in that shaft right now." Silence settled over the group for a moment. I expected fear, or at least hesitation. The kind of pause that comes before someone decides a plan has become too dangerous to attempt. Instead, I watched Owen Blake simply check the charge on a device strapped to his hip, his expression unreadable. "Then we deal with them," he said. 12 people are still waiting on the other side of that door. That has not changed." Ellie Marsh nodded once, already turning toward the direction I had indicated on the schematic. "Kale, lead us there," she said. "Derek, Owen, you are with me. Grace, stay here and keep working that control panel in case we find another way to release it from the inside. The rest of you, keep clearing debris from this corridor in case we need a fast path back out." Nobody argued. Nobody asked for more time to think it over. They simply moved, and I found myself moving with them, pulled along by something that felt less like courage and more like the simple refusal to be the reason anyone hesitated. The maintenance shaft entrance was a narrow hatch set into the floor, barely wide enough for a single person to pass through at a time. Ellie Marsh knelt beside it, pressing her ear against the metal for a long moment before speaking. "I hear movement," she said quietly. "Multiple sources. Small, but many." "How many is many?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Enough that we should assume the worst, and be pleasantly surprised if it turns out better," she replied, which did very little to ease the tightness building in my chest. She opened the hatch slowly, careful to make as little noise as possible, and lowered herself down into the darkness below. Derek followed close behind her, then gestured for me to wait, while Owen guarded the opening above. Through the narrow gap, I could see the beam of Ellie's shoulder light sweeping across a cramped tunnel, lined with pipes and cables, many of them torn loose and sparking weakly. And there, clinging to the walls in small clusters, were the scavenger creatures I had feared, pale, many-legged things about the size of a human hand, their bodies covered in fine bristles that shimmered faintly under the light. They did not attack immediately. They simply watched, dozens of small dark eyes reflecting the light back toward us, their bodies utterly still, in a way that felt more unsettling than if they had simply charged forward. "They are territorial," I whispered down to Ellie. "They will defend this space if they feel threatened, but they generally avoid confrontation with anything larger than themselves. "Good to know," she murmured back. "Derek, clear a path along the left wall. I will take the right. Move steady. Do not run. Do not make sudden movements. Kale, stay above with Owen until we call you down." I watched from the opening as the two of them advanced through the tunnel with slow, deliberate movements, careful not to startle the creatures clinging to the walls around them. For a moment, it seemed like their caution might be enough, that we might slip past this obstacle without incident. Then a loose length of cable, disturbed by Derek's passing, swung free and struck one of the creatures directly, sending it tumbling from its perch with a sharp, high-pitched shriek. The reaction was immediate. Dozens of small bodies detached from the walls at once, swarming toward the source of the disturbance in a chaotic, chittering mass. Derek raised an arm instinctively to shield his face, and I felt my whole body go rigid with fear, watching the creatures converge on him. "Derek," Ellie called out sharply. "I am fine," he replied, though strain colored his voice as several of the creatures latched onto his suit, their small forms scrabbling against the reinforced fabric. "These things do not have much bite behind them. Just keep moving." True to his word, the creatures seemed more startled than aggressive, their bristled bodies designed more for clinging and defense than genuine harm. Derek simply continued forward, brushing them away with careful, controlled movements, refusing to let their presence slow his progress, despite the discomfort clearly written across his face. Ellie reached the far end of the tunnel first, where a second hatch led up into the trapped section beyond the blast door. She called back to us, her voice carrying clearly, despite the chittering chaos still surrounding Derek. "I found the access point. Kale, get down here now. I need you to confirm this connects to the trapped section." I dropped down into the tunnel, Owen close behind me, and picked my way carefully past the scattered creatures, most of which had already begun retreating back to the shadows now that the disturbance had passed. I reached Ellie's position and studied the hatch above us, cross-referencing it against the schematic still glowing on my device. "Yes," I confirmed. "This should open directly into the corridor outside the trapped section, close enough that we can reach the colonists without needing to breach the blast door itself." "Then let us move," Ellie said, already working the release mechanism on the hatch above. It took several attempts, the mechanism stiff with age and lack of use, but eventually the hatch gave way, and we climbed up into a corridor thick with the smell of recycled air pushed to its absolute limit. Ahead of us, through a reinforced window, I could see the trapped colonists, huddled together against the cold, several of the smaller children clinging tightly to the adults around them, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. The moment they did, a ripple of hope passed visibly across their faces, several of them rushing toward the window, pressing their hands against the reinforced glass, as if trying to physically reach through to us. "We need to get that window open, or find another path directly to them," I said, studying the structure around us with growing urgency. Owen Blake was already moving past me, running his hands along the edge of the reinforced window frame, searching for weaknesses in the seal. "This will not be pretty," he said, "but it will work." He retrieved a small device from his belt, pressing it against the corner of the window frame, and stepped back, gesturing for the rest of us to move clear. A moment later, a controlled burst of heat sliced cleanly through the frame's edge, weakening the seal just enough for Derek to step forward and press both hands against the glass itself. "On my count," he said. 1, 2. He pushed, and the weakened window gave way, folding inward rather than shattering outward, thanks to whatever careful calculation had gone into Owen's initial cut. The colonists on the other side stumbled back in surprise, then surged forward the moment they realized what had happened, desperate to reach the fresh air now flowing through the newly created opening. "One at a time," Ellie called out, her voice firm but not unkind. "Children first. We have you. Nobody is being left behind." What followed was among the most careful, controlled evacuations I had ever witnessed, 6 humans coordinating with a precision that left no room for panic, guiding frightened children through the opening first, followed by their parents, followed by the elderly and the injured. Each person checked quickly for signs of distress before being passed back toward Grace Fenwick and the medical teams waiting near the original blast door. Throughout it all, I noticed something that stayed with me long after that day had ended. Despite the urgency, despite the danger, despite the swarm of scavenger creatures still chittering somewhere in the tunnel behind us, not one of these humans raised their voice in anger toward a single frightened colonist. Whatever fire burned inside them, whatever had brought them here with such fierce, unrelenting urgency, they directed it entirely toward the obstacles standing between them and the people who needed saving, never once toward the people themselves. The last colonist through the window was an elderly woman, moving slowly, clearly exhausted from the ordeal. Derek Voss lifted her gently, cradling her weight as though she weighed nothing at all, and carried her the rest of the way without a single complaint about the effort it clearly cost him after everything he had already done that day. "You are safe now," he told her quietly. "You are all safe now." As the last of the 12 colonists were guided back toward medical care, I found myself standing beside Ellie Marsh in the now empty, ruined section of Sector 11, both of us breathing hard, both of us finally allowing ourselves a moment of stillness after everything that had just happened. "Is that all of them?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would not be simple. Ellie checked a display on her wrist, her expression tightening slightly as new information scrolled across it. "Sector 14 just went dark," she said. "Fire suppression failure. We have more work to do." I felt exhaustion settling into my bones at those words, a bone-deep weariness that came from hours of fear and adrenaline, with no end yet in sight. And yet, looking at Ellie Marsh's face, I saw no trace of that same exhaustion reflected back at me. I saw only the same sharp, focused urgency that had carried her through every challenge so far, undimmed, unyielding, ready to carry the rest of her team into whatever waited for us next. "Then let us go," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. For the first time since this crisis began, Ellie Marsh looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Let us go," she agreed, and together we moved deeper into the wreckage of our dying station, toward whatever challenge waited for us next. Sector 14 brought us face to face with fire in a way none of the previous sections had. Without proper suppression systems, flames had spread through cargo storage, feeding on stored fuel cells that should have been secured hours before any of this began. The heat hit us like a wall the moment we rounded the final corner, thick black smoke curling along the ceiling, emergency lighting barely visible through the haze. "Suppression foam reserves," Ellie Marsh called out, coughing slightly despite the filtered air her suit provided. "Do you have any left in this section, Kale?" I checked my device, my eyes stinging even through the protective visor Owen had given me earlier. "There is a secondary tank, but the release valve requires manual activation from inside the storage bay itself." "Of course it does," Derek muttered, already moving toward the sealed bay door. This time, when the door opened, we found 6 colonists trapped inside, coughing violently, pressed as far back from the flames as the small space allowed. Among them was a young father shielding his daughter with his own body, both of them clearly struggling to breathe in air thick with smoke and heat. Owen Blake moved first, pulling a compact device from his pack that released a fine mist across the immediate area, thinning the smoke just enough to see clearly. Grace Fenwick followed close behind, her scanner already identifying the location of the manual release valve buried somewhere within the burning wreckage of collapsed shelving. "Valve is behind that fuel cell rack," she said, pointing toward a section of the bay where flames burned hottest. "Someone needs to reach it without triggering a secondary explosion from the remaining cells." Nobody hesitated, though I noticed something shift in the group's energy, a tightening of focus that told me they understood exactly how dangerous this particular task would be. "I will go," Derek said. "No," Ellie replied immediately, her voice sharp with something that sounded almost like fear, though I had not heard fear from her since this crisis began. "You have been carrying weight and taking hits all day. Owen, you have the steadiest hands. You go." Owen nodded once, already moving toward the burning rack without further discussion, his movements careful and precise despite the obvious danger. I watched him navigate around collapsed shelving, testing each step before committing his full weight, his focus absolute even as sweat poured down his face from the heat. He reached the valve after what felt like an eternity, though it could not have been more than 30 seconds, and twisted it hard. A hissing rush of foam erupted from hidden nozzles across the bay, smothering the flames in thick white layers, the roar of fire slowly dying down to a weak sputtering hiss. For a moment, it seemed like the crisis had passed without further cost. Then, just as the flames finally extinguished completely, a section of damaged shelving that had been weakened by the fire gave way entirely, collapsing directly toward where Owen still stood near the valve. "Owen!" Ellie shouted. He turned, saw the falling shelving, and threw himself sideways, avoiding the worst of the impact, but not all of it. A glancing section of metal caught his shoulder, spinning him hard into the wall, and he crumpled to the ground amid the scattered foam and debris. Derek reached him first, sliding to his knees beside him, checking quickly for injuries with hands that trembled slightly despite his obvious effort to stay calm. "Talk to me," Derek said. "Owen, talk to me." "I am fine," Owen managed, though his voice came out strained, one arm clearly held at an unnatural angle. "Dislocated, I think. Nothing worse." Grace arrived moments later, her scanner already running across his injured shoulder, her expression tight with concentration as she worked. "Dislocated. Confirmed. No fractures. He will need it set properly, but he can still move under his own power." Relief passed visibly across the group, though it did not fully erase the tension that had settled over everyone in those brief, terrifying seconds. Ellie helped Owen to his feet carefully, supporting his weight on his uninjured side, while the 6 previously trapped colonists were guided safely out of the smoke-filled bay toward waiting medical teams. Once the immediate danger had passed, once Owen had been settled against a support beam, while Grace carefully worked his shoulder back into place with practiced, careful movements, I found myself sitting nearby, still shaken from how close we had come to losing him entirely. "Does this happen often?" I asked quietly, unsure if the question was appropriate, but unable to hold it back any longer. "This kind of danger, this kind of cost." Owen glanced toward me, his face pale from pain, but his eyes still sharp, still alert, despite everything his body had just endured. "More often than anyone would like," he admitted, "but less often than it would if we hesitated." "I do not understand," I said. "Why does your fleet send teams like yours, teams clearly carrying so much anger, so much urgency, into situations already this dangerous? Would it not be safer to send calmer people, people less likely to take these kinds of risks?" A quiet moment passed before Owen answered, his gaze drifting toward Ellie Marsh, who stood nearby directing the last of the evacuation efforts with the same sharp focus she had carried since first stepping onto our station. "Calm people hesitate," he said finally, "not because they do not care, but because calm gives you room to think, and thinking gives you room to doubt. Doubt costs seconds. Seconds cost lives." He shifted slightly against the support beam, wincing as Grace finished her work on his shoulder, then continued. "People like us, we do not have that same room to doubt. Something happened to each of us, somewhere along the way, that took away our ability to hesitate when someone is in danger. For me, it was a fire much like this one, a long time ago, on a different station, where I hesitated for exactly 3 seconds too long before pulling someone free. She did not make it. I have not hesitated since." I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle over me differently than anything else I had witnessed that day. "So this anger," I said slowly, "it is not simply anger." "No," Owen agreed. "It is grief that never found anywhere else to go. It is love that got there too late once, and refuses to be late again. Calm people get sent when there is time to be calm. When there is no time left at all, they send us." Before I could respond, Grace's scanner let out a sharp alert, and her expression shifted immediately from focused concentration to something far more urgent. "New reading," she said. "Sector 9 again. The one we already cleared. Structural integrity dropping fast. Secondary collapse imminent. There are still 2 engineering staff working inside, trying to stabilize the breach manually." Ellie Marsh appeared beside us immediately, her earlier relief already replaced by renewed urgency. "How long?" she asked. "Maybe 4 minutes before that whole section folds in on itself," Grace replied. Owen tried to push himself upright despite his injured shoulder, and Ellie placed a firm hand against his chest, holding him still. "You are staying here," she said. "Derek, Callum, with me. Kale, can you guide us there faster than we found it the first time? I nodded, already moving, though something cold had settled into my chest at the mention of only 4 minutes remaining. I had seen these humans move fast already, had seen them accomplish things I would have believed impossible only hours before, but 4 minutes felt like an impossibly small margin, even for them. As we ran, Ellie's voice carried back to me, low and fierce, clearly meant for herself as much as anyone listening. "Not this time," she muttered, "not one more." I did not fully understand what she meant by those words in that moment. I only understood, watching her push herself harder with every step, that whatever grief had shaped her the way it had shaped Owen, whatever loss had carved this fierce, unrelenting urgency into every one of these humans, none of them intended to let this day add another name to whatever list they carried silently within themselves. We reached Sector 9 with barely a minute to spare, the walls around us already groaning under stresses no structure should have been asked to bear. And there, in those final desperate seconds, I watched Ellie Marsh and Derek Voss do something that should not have been possible, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life, long after this terrible day had finally come to an end. The two engineers were named Torin and Wexley, both of them working desperately against a control panel wedged between two buckling support beams, trying to reroute power away from a strained section before the entire wall gave way completely. Neither of them heard us approaching over the groaning metal surrounding them, both too focused on the failing readouts in front of them to notice how little time remained. "Get clear," Derek shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Now both of you, move." Wexley turned first, his eyes widening at the sight of the beam directly above them beginning to buckle inward. Torin remained frozen, still trying to complete whatever final adjustment he believed might stabilize the section, unwilling to abandon the work even as the ceiling above him started to fail. "Torin," I called out, my own voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "Leave it, please, leave it now." That seemed to break through whatever focus had held him in place, and he finally turned, scrambling backward just as Ellie Marsh reached him, grabbing his arm and pulling him clear with a strength that seemed impossible given her frame. Derek reached Wexley at nearly the same moment, though the ceiling had already begun its final collapse, a section of reinforced plating breaking free directly above where Wexley had been standing only seconds before. There was no time for careful positioning, no time for anything except pure reaction. Derek threw himself forward, wrapping both arms around Wexley and driving them both to the ground, rolling clear of the falling debris in a single desperate motion. The section crashed down exactly where they had been standing, sending a shockwave of dust and noise through the already unstable corridor. For a terrible moment, neither of them moved. "Derek!" Ellie shouted, releasing Torin and scrambling toward the settling dust. Then, slowly, both figures stirred, Derek pushing himself up first, then reaching down to help Wexley to his feet. Both were covered in dust and scattered debris, both breathing hard, but both very clearly alive. "That," Derek said, his voice rough but steady, "was closer than I would like." Relief washed through the corridor so strongly I could almost feel it as a physical thing, a collective release of tension that had been building since the moment Grace's scanner had first sounded its alarm. Torin, still shaking from how close he had come to losing everything, reached out and gripped Derek's arm tightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I do not know how to properly thank you for this." Derek simply nodded, already turning to check on the rest of his team, already moving past the moment, as though gratitude, while appreciated, was not something he needed in order to have done what he had just done. Ellie Marsh keyed her comm unit, her voice carrying clearly through the settling dust. "Sector 9 secured. All personnel accounted for. Grace, how are the other sectors holding?" There was a brief pause before Grace's voice returned, sounding tired but steady. "All critical sections stabilized. We have cleared everyone from the immediate danger zones. Remaining work is recovery and repair, not rescue." I felt something in my chest finally begin to unclench at those words, a tightness I had been carrying since the very first alarm had sounded hours before. It was over. Whatever else remained to be done, the immediate crisis, the desperate race against collapsing walls and failing life support, had finally come to an end. Over the following hours, Response Wing 12 remained on Colony Dorn 7, assisting our own engineering teams with repairs, sharing medical supplies with our overwhelmed clinic, and coordinating with Station Command to ensure every remaining pocket of damage had been properly addressed. Throughout all of it, they worked with the same tireless focus they had shown from the very first moment they stepped through our airlock, never once complaining about exhaustion, never once asking for recognition beyond simply finishing the job in front of them. By the time the last emergency alert finally cleared from our systems, the sun equivalent of our station's artificial day cycle had fully turned, and I found myself standing on the same observation deck where this entire crisis had begun, watching Response Wing 12 prepare their ship for departure. Belwick Adrun stood beside me, his earlier pale gray color finally returning to its normal shade, though exhaustion still lined every feature of his face. "We owe them a great debt," he said quietly. "I intend to formally request their commendation through proper channels. The Dorith Mining Authority does not forget those who saved this many lives." I nodded in agreement, though something still nagged at the back of my mind, a question I had been carrying since that very first tense conversation over the emergency comm channel, hours before Response Wing 12 had ever arrived. Before their ship departed, I approached Ellie Marsh one final time, finding her near the airlock, running a final check across her equipment before boarding. "I have a question," I said, "if you do not mind." She looked up, her expression tired but not unkind. "Go ahead. When we first sent our distress call, we were told you were the nearest available unit. I assumed that meant you were simply the closest specialized rescue team in this region of space. But watching everything your team accomplished today, the skill, the coordination, the sheer determination none of you ever seemed to lose, I find myself wondering, are you truly considered a standard response unit? Or were we simply fortunate enough to receive one of humanity's most elite teams?" Something flickered across Ellie's face, an expression I could not quite identify, somewhere between amusement and something more complicated. "Response Wing 12, she said, is not an elite unit. We are not the best trained team in our fleet, and we are certainly not the most experienced. We are simply the team that happened to be closest when your beacon came through, and the team that happened to already be awake and ready to move the moment that alarm sounded." I stared at her, trying to process what she had just told me. "You are saying there are teams more skilled than yours?" "Plenty," she confirmed. "We are good at what we do not misunderstand me, but elite units exist, teams with better equipment, more advanced training, years of specialized experience that none of us can claim. We were simply available, and available was what your station needed most in that moment." I thought about everything I had witnessed that day, the impossible speed with which they had arrived, the way Derek Voss had lifted collapsing beams with nothing but raw determination, the way Owen Blake had pushed through injury without complaint, the way Ellie herself had pulled a frightened engineer clear of certain death with strength that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond simple physical training. If this was merely an average response team, simply the unit that happened to be closest and already awake, I found myself struggling to imagine what an elite unit might be capable of. "Why were you already awake?" I asked. "Why were you ready to move so quickly, faster than any protocol should have allowed?" Ellie's expression shifted again, something tightening around her eyes that told me this question touched on something more personal than the others had. "We had just come from another mission," she said quietly, "one that did not go the way we needed it to. We were still processing that when your beacon came through. I suppose you could say we were already carrying more than our fair share of frustration that day, and your emergency simply gave us somewhere useful to put it." I did not press further, sensing that whatever loss had preceded our own crisis was not something she wished to discuss with someone she had only just met. Instead, I simply nodded, filing away everything I had learned that day, everything I would need to properly understand for future reports back to the Dorith Mining Authority. As Ellie turned to board her ship, she paused once more, glancing back toward me with something that looked almost like a smile, faint and tired, but genuine. "For what it is worth," she said, "your colony was lucky today, not because we are the best team humanity has to offer, but because whoever was on duty when your beacon arrived happened to already be angry enough to move fast, and stubborn enough to refuse losing anyone else that day." With that, she disappeared into the airlock, and moments later, their scarred, battle-worn ship pulled away from our damaged docking ring, accelerating into the black with the same fierce urgency that had carried them through every challenge since their arrival. I stood on that observation deck for a long time after they had gone, watching the stars slowly return to stillness, thinking about everything I had witnessed and everything Ellie Marsh had told me in those final moments before departure. In the months that followed, I made it my personal mission to properly research humanity's response fleet structure, determined to understand exactly what kind of teams existed within their ranks and where Response Wing 12 truly fit among them. What I discovered only confirmed everything Ellie had told me and added a layer of understanding I had not expected to find. Humanity, it turned out, organized much of their emergency response around something they called readiness rotation, ensuring that teams recently returned from difficult missions remained on standby for immediate deployment rather than resting immediately afterward. The reasoning, according to several official documents I managed to access, was surprisingly practical. Teams processing recent loss, recent frustration, recent grief, responded to new emergencies with a level of urgency and determination that calmer, more rested teams simply could not match. In other words, humanity had learned, through what must have been considerable trial and difficult experience, that anger properly focused, properly directed towards saving lives rather than causing harm, made for remarkably effective rescue workers. Not because anger itself was virtuous, but because it refused, in ways calm composure sometimes could not, to accept failure as an option. I shared this understanding eventually with Belwick Adrun, and together we quietly amended our own colony's emergency protocols, no longer simply requesting the nearest available help from our allied species, but specifically requesting whatever team happened to be most urgently motivated in that particular moment. Word of what happened on Colony Dorn 7 spread slowly through Allied channels over the following months, carried by station commanders and liaison officers who had heard our story secondhand and found themselves both amused and slightly unsettled by its implications. A quiet piece of advice began circulating among those of us who regularly interacted with human fleets, advice that I myself had come to believe wholeheartedly after everything I witnessed that day. Never assume you understand humanity simply because you have met their calm, patient diplomats. Never assume their capacity for gentle negotiation represents the full scope of what they are capable of. And should you ever find yourself in genuine crisis, desperate enough to send out an emergency beacon with no idea who might answer, take comfort in one simple truth learned through hard experience across countless allied worlds. You do not want humanity's calmest people showing up to save you. You want the ones who are still angry enough to refuse losing anyone else that day. Because those are the ones who will tear through burning wreckage with their bare hands, who will hold collapsing ceilings steady on nothing but sheer stubborn will, who will run toward danger rather than away from it, not because they lack fear, but because somewhere along the way, grief taught them that hesitation costs more than any personal risk ever could. Colony Dorn 7 survived that day because 6 angry humans happened to be awake and ready when our beacon reached them. 412 lives continued because Response Wing 12 carried something into that crisis that no amount of calm, careful training could ever fully replace. I do not know what mission preceded ours, what loss had shaped their urgency so sharply before they ever answered our call. I never learned the details, and I suspect I never will. But I know this. Whatever it was, whatever grief drove them to move as fast and as fiercely as they did that day, I remain endlessly grateful that our colony's darkest hour happened to align with theirs. Because sometimes, the very worst day in someone else's life becomes the reason your own worst day does not end in tragedy. And sometimes, against every expectation you carried into that moment, the angriest people you have ever met turn out to be exactly the people you needed most.